Hello and most welcome to 1175 must be. Yeah. We will soldier on with György here, but to make it a bit more interesting I will compare with another book later on. Well, that book is going to be Louder Than Words, The New Science of How the Mind Makes Meaning by Benjamin K Bergen. It shows that the brain is doing its modeling in the same speed, at the same distance, in the same direction, same angle as we actually do things. And this is something that, of course, is proven also by György, or shown by György, maybe a more correct way of saying. But nevertheless, it's quite interesting, and it's of course pointing to a much deeper connection between reality and ourselves, or as György would have it, ourselves and reality. Meaning for Bergen as György is what it's substantiate meaning. So meaning is no longer transcendent, rather meaning is of the world. Very important. Meaning is of the world. The sounds, the smells, movement, visual representation, tonality, density, that is meaning. So we are using in the brain exactly the same area and action potential as we actually do things when we are simulating something. There is no difference for the brain. Simulation and action is the same thing. So thoughts now become much more real, so to speak, and they are only real if they are connected to the outer world. We are using the same area to speak and talk to ourselves as we're using for talking to others. And it also gives an insight into grammar, that grammar in the language has its absolute and exact equivalence in thinking. It needs to be ordered in a specific certain way. It needs to have extension and pitch. Pitch is in my voice, I pitch this, but is also in the brain. A prosody, a temporality in the brain. And that goes equally very, very parallel to the two things parallel each other very nicely. Meaning, according to Benjamin Bergen, is something that you point words to. When you're learning a new language, you are pointing words to meaning. It's a bit like shooting an arrow or throwing a dart. You try to get it righter and righter. I know that is not correct grammar, but more and more correct sounds a bit chilly. Closer and closer to the 120 points, the triple 60. and meaning is always of the world. It has all the traits and they are not discernible from real experience. They are actually the same thing. Cannot say mental experience are unreal, as would be from the Cartesian cut, but you cannot say they are more real than reality either, which would be the direction taken by some philosophers, the idealists, like Fichte. So this is both at the same time, and only when they are complementary it works. And I really like this, they are as different as can be. The substantiality of the world, so different from the thinking capacity, but they are also, in another way, somewhat same. Both are needed. We imagine sounds. If we try to hear a sound or a melody, it is exactly the same function area as hearing a sound. There is no difference at all. The Klein bottle once more. The same area of the brain activate for executing an action, thinking about an action, and understanding a word about an action. Exactly the same workings areas. Think how about people will simulate the movement when you're writing a sentence. If the definition of the object or its shape is at the end of the sentence, it will take longer for the reader to simulate that scene. So there is a very clear equivalence of the complication of something and how much effort is needed from the side of the brain. It is never easier for the brain to imagine a complicated movement or a tough movement. So that connection is very clear. We can't do things with our imaginations that are unreal, so to speak. So don't see it as a limitation. But I think there is a non-serious, superficial way I often hear when I speak about quantum mechanics, that the writings of Benjamin K. Bergen can dissolve. And it's this ludicrous idea, well, if I collapse by my will the superposition, then I can conjure everything. You cannot conjure anything more in your mind than you can conjure it in the world. They are completely equal. And this is from all neuroscience in the area that Bergen, Bujacki, E.M. McGilchrist gets its stuff. Bradel, definitely Bradel, Lisa Friedman Barrett. You cannot imagine anything. You can say you can imagine, that is a different thing, but you cannot imagine something just by wanting it, just by will. You need to train yourself in thinking first. Then you might be able to both think it and do it, but that would be the hard way to do it. To go about, according to Benjamin, K Bergen is easier to do it. When you've done complicated things with your hands in the everyday life, like I put in a SIM card from this one to the other one, which took some effort, didn't fit, I need to think and I need to be detailed. That will help you to think sharper. And this is something that we have very little understanding of in the Western world. Of course, because of the Cartesian cut, that people are even closed off from their own thinking is serious enough. But any idea of there being any development in thinking / action, which is complementarity there according to the Klein bottle, or in view of the Klein bottle. So if you have a complicated book in a scene, Shakespeare could be Othello, and that complicated scene when he speaks with Sheldrake, is his name? Mandrake? The word went out of my brain. But to imagine that scene takes a lot of effort. There is no effortless imagination. It takes skill, because the thinking skills are exact as the moving hand skill. Sloppy hands is sloppy thinking. There's absolute 100% correlation there. And sloppy hands also means no access to your own life. The more you access your own life, the less sloppy the hand is going to be. Better than, as we explained the other day, to train your hand, train your dominant hand, doing complicated curves, angles, curves you use for your thinking. And the temporality, which is the speed of the fudo, the brush, if you remember the lecture I had about Japanese calligraphy, shodo. If you're being affected by this fantastic instrument, the magnetic camera, that can actually send inductive current over your head, or magnetic field influence of different brain areas, that can block out the inner speech effectively and make it impossible for you to go about your ordinary things. Rather scary thing. Ian McGilchrist has also worked with this, the TMS it's called, can block out the left hemisphere, and you can check out what happens in the right hemisphere, and vice versa, and different area as the prefrontal cortex, which makes it hard to execute. And that is another explanation / there, it makes it hard to plan thinking. Of course, what language you are thinking is going to influence your movements. There is an exact correlation there. So Benjamin K. Bergen is not in the idea of an equivalence between different languages. That is crude comparison. When it comes to the finer details and meanings, those are language specific. So the Cartesian cut always sort of reinforces its own worldview. If you have that non-distinctive, blurry thinking that Cartesian cut thinking is, you will assume that all languages have the same objects / words and meanings. It's very far from the case. We know now meaning is so connected to who you are, who your body is situated, in what balance it is, what movements you do during the day. All those 50 to 60,000 bodily movements are of great importance to how meaning is building up in your system / the world. I don't think that is so hard to realize. If you are in a certain group that is isolated by a language barrier, you're bound to develop differently, and your thinking therefore become divergent. So maybe that is one of the biggest neglects in the modern world, that we do not see that we think differently. We think the differences are quite slight. And I would say that is proven clearly by people who think, oh, how odd, that word didn't mean that the same thing as in my language. Or Swedish people have this word lagom, you can't find it in other languages. It is much more than that. It could be that it is exactly the same word. And in the lexicon, the dictionary, you find similar explanations, but the bodily meaning, the action meaning, that is the only meaning that counts, because that's the real meaning. Of that, we can most usually know little to nothing. Sometimes it's clearer what it is. Some people can explain it. Maybe it is not so easy to explain in words. Here I think music, art, architecture, way of moving about, facial expressions can show much more than a wordly explanation. Because wordly explanation directly puts you into your own language, whereas a gesture can be something you can look at maybe a bit more openly, not as judging and saying that's the same word. It has my meaning. Causation and Logic in Neuroscience, Chapter 2 of the book Mind Inside Out. György Buzaki, and we are currently on, let's see what page it is. Nihil in terra sine causa fit. The Bible. Everything connects to everything else. Leonardo da Vinci. The law of causation is a relic of bygone age, surviving like the monarchy only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm. Bertrand Russell, the one and only. After coming to America as a postdoctoral fellow, I gradually learned how strongly our upbringing affects our interpretation of the world. Different cultures shape the brain differently, making it difficult to emphasize with a new society that holds viewpoints that are distinct from the social milieu where you spent your formative years. Shaking hands while looking at another's eyes induces different emotions than bowing and expressing submission. Most people agree that our upbringing is linked to our prejudices. I often wondered whether cultural differences can appear not only in moral and emotional issues, but also in scientific thinking. Even practices that appear trivial, such as reading and writing from left to right and vice versa, may influence the workings of the brain. Can we somehow put ourselves outside our subjective world and use objective methods to make valid judgments without being influenced by our pasts? If my reasoning has some merit, then examining the same problems from multiple angles may be useful in understanding the brain. Let's start by evaluating our everyday tools for reasoning in the Western world, logic and correlations, and the necessary and sufficient conditions for causation. Observations, co-occurrences, and correlations. Hypotheses in the neurosciences are most often tested by models of associations between observed properties of the world. Inspection of cloud dots. A simple way to quantify the relationship between larger intervals and how an animal walks in the woods. There is an illustration here, figure 2.1. Each dot corresponds to the measured distance between what an animal walked in an experimental apparatus, plotted against time difference between the spikes of neuron pairs. The black line is a linear regression of all values, taking into consideration the tails of distribution. The sigmoid gray line is a better fit. B, an alternative interpretation is that there are actually two clouds, black and gray, which have different relationships between distance representation and time lag of spikes. So we continue here, sorry about that. Observation, co-occurrences, and correlations. Hypotheses in the neurosciences are most often tested by models of associations between observed properties of the world. The figure I was mentioning is a list of spikes and show the relation between movement and neural assessment in the brain. And longer distances moved about also corresponds to larger intervals between spikes. A simple way to quantify this relationship is to fit a regression line over the values. The line is a great simplification and assumption that all measurements are represented by the regression line. The slope of the line and the magnitude of the variance of the values on both sides of the line indicate the reliability and strength of the relationship. This regularity is a co-relationship or correlation, in which approximately the same number of values lie above and below the regression line. While a plot such as that in figure 2.1 shows only the values of observations, we often wish to read much more from a static cloud of data points. For example, there are many empty areas without measured values on the graph. We can simply assume that those values exist so that if we had more time and more funding to generate more data, those new points would fill in the blanks between the already measured ones. This operation, performed intuitively or with mathematical rigor, is called interpolation. But we can also call it explanation or deduction. Postdiction would be another possible term, because interpolation is done based on the data collected in the past. If we feel comfortable filling the graph with imagined data between the dots, perhaps it's not much of a jump to imagine more data that extend the cloud, again following the trend in observations. This operation is called extrapolation or induction. Alternatively, we can call it prediction or guessing from the currently available data, an act of logical inference. It is an abstraction from the present, which amounts to predicting the future. Here's the important point. How far can we go in our extrapolation of the graph? Just because two sets of variables correlate now, there is no guarantee that this correlation will continue into the future. Interpolation or extrapolation as mathematical abstractions are independent of the objects or observations being represented. The graph itself is an abstract relationship. The dots have lost their physical correspondences and are now embedded in a mathematical graph. In fact, the same dots could represent any relationship and are thus substrate-free. For example, they could represent an observed relationship between emotional magnitude and neuronal firing. In contrast, the interpretation of the relationship always depends on their substrate. Real things have a physical substance because the substrates of the variables are missing from the graph. The experimenter adds them in his or her interpretation to deduce a substrate-dependent mechanism that supposedly explain the observed relationships. This interpretational desire is the reason we give various names such as contingency, dependence, interdependence, indication, anticipation, prediction, or forecasting. I might add fortune-telling or crystal gazing to such simple X and Y relationship. In our example in figure In our example in figure 2.1, we took distance as the independent variable in the tradition of the outside-in framework. The distance between the two place fields in the maze can be measured objectively by a ruler, and the goal is to learn how distance is represented. I need to have this into something. The distance between the two place fields in the maze can be measured objectively by a ruler, and the goal is to learn how distance is represented in the brain, e.g. by time offsets. In a sense, we are asking how distance predicts duration. However, as you will see later on, the brain internally generates time offsets between neuronal spikes, and with the help of the locomotion speed of the animal, it calculates the distances. In the inside-out framework, the cause is a brain mechanism, and the consequence is distance estimation. Distances are meaningless to a naive brain without calibrating the visual clues with action. Thus, depending on the framework, the cause and effect relationships can change. However, another experimenter may disagree with our interpretation of the X-Y relationship. At the ends of the clouds, there are fewer data points, but those seem to lose their linear relationship characteristic of other data points. Perhaps a sigmoid function is a better fit. To a third observer, the cloud of dots may appear to be split. When all the dots are lumped together in our mind, the single cloud interpretation justifies the use of the term integration or pattern completion. By analogy to completing a picture or a sentence with missing details. But the more experienced eye of the third observer suggests that there are actually two clouds, and therefore two relationships exist. A case of segregation or pattern separation. Do the points in the graph reflect a single integrated relationship or two segregated ones? The regression problem then becomes a classification problem. Our scientific vocabulary and views are often formed by data plots, even if they are more sophisticated than those shown in this simple figure. Without an arbitrator or supervisor, we cannot tell who's right and who's wrong. In figure 2.1, we identify some regularity between two variables. One is the thing to be explained, the explanandum, called the dependent y variable, and the other is the thing that explains. explanans, called the independent x variable. In more general terms, we can also call them the defined concept and the defining concept. Of course, our strongest desire is to conclude that one variable predicts or causes the other. Ideally, the defining concept is more general than the defined concept, with some asymmetry between them. The brain is a machine, however, the other way around. The machine is a brain, does not apply. Accordingly, our choice to call on one variable independent and the other dependent is often arbitrary and may reflect our preconceived bias. In some cases, we are able to manipulate the independent variable experimentally and observe its effect on the dependent variable. In neuroscience, we often observe quantities which we cannot manipulate directly or for which there is no way of independently manipulate a single variable without indirectly manipulating many more properties of the system. In this case, the choice of calling one variable independent and the other dependent is often arbitrary and reflects a bias. In fact, the plot itself is symmetric and its statistical description would be the same if we reversed the x and y coordinates. The ratios would not change. Yet in neuroscience, we place behavioral observations or stimulus features on the x-axis, in this instance the distance walked, and brain measure on the y-axis. This tradition takes its origin from the outside-in framework as discussed in Chapter 1. Putting aside this historical issue, may we be able to make causal inference from such data by plotting and evaluating the correlational measurements in some other way. Equally important, we should ask about our confidence in the prediction, the probability of being right or wrong. Are these observational data enough, or do we need to do additional experiments? To show convincingly that one variable causes the other, we must vary the independent values experimentally and examine how the dependent variable follows such changes. Direct manipulation of physical objects is the most basic way for arguing the persuasive rule of cause and effect. When a child discovers that flipping a light switch can make the room appear and disappear, he repeatedly practices it to learn that he is the sole causative agent of the consequences. Similarly, when a rat presses a lever that delivers food, it repeatedly tests the consequences of its action. It seems that functioning in the world requires animals to develop the concept of cause-effect relationships. Both mathematics and scientific thinking require logic. All mathematical theories can be reduced to some collection of axioms or set of rules on which an internally consistent system is built. These axioms should not be violated, but science is supposedly different. It has no a priori rules. We simply observe regularities in nature and call them laws. When we interfere with those regularities, we become part of the relationship and therefore may alter it. As Werner Heisenberg, the father of uncertainty in quantum mechanics, famously stated, "What we observe is not nature, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." This healthy skepticism is important because our measuring instruments may affect the cause-effect relationship. Every action we take has an effect on the system we wish to observe. However, this cause and effect situation runs deeper than just a difficulty in experimental science. It forms the root of scientific inference in the Western world. Once the cause is revealed, the problem is explained. How very good. The truth is found. In traditional wisdom, there are no effects without causes, and no logical argument can be delivered without causation. Western philosophy is built on a foundation of causality, yet much of the world has moved forward and onward without accepting such causality rules. The idea of causation is completely different in Asian cultures than in European cultures. For example, in Buddhist philosophy, nothing exists as a singular independent entity because things and events depend on multiple co-arising conditions. A Buddhist monk or teacher lights 3 incense sticks leaning against each other as a demonstration that if any of the sticks falls, the others will fall as well. Similarly, Confucian approached causation in an all-encompassing manner, searching for a network of connections. Historical changes are explained by coincidences of events instead of particular cause. In Muslim philosophy, causal relations have no inherent necessity at all. Instead, they are just expressions of what God does. Therefore, it should not surprise us that people from different cultures, yet with the same kind of brains, judge the affairs of the world surrounding us differently. So why do we assume that the European philosophy of science is the superior, or rather only way to view the world and ourselves, especially given that many other cultures have achieved great scientific discoveries? Is it really true that when the cause is identified, the truth is found? Even Descartes hesitated to accept such a link. Even Descartes hesitated to accept such a link. First, he stated, if a cause allows all the phenomena to be clearly deduced from it, then it is virtually impossible that it should not be true. But then he immediately backtracks and adds, nevertheless, I want causes that I shall set out here to be regarded simply as hypotheses, because we often make assumptions which are agreed to be false. The modern meaning of the term hypothesis refers to conjecture which can be rejected by observation or experiments. In Sanskrit, there is a word pratya samupatta, origination, and it refers to the principle of interdependent causation and explains the 12-fold chain that describes the endless rebirth of life. In metaphysics, accidentalism denies the doctrine that everything occurs or results from a definite cause. The modern meaning of the term hypothesis refers to conjecture which can be rejected by observation or experiments, and thus eliminating potential causes rather than proving the truth. Scientific knowledge is tentative and not definitive. It is progressive but not absolute. Cause and effect. Causality is a subtle metaphysical notion, an abstraction that indicates how events in the world progress. The common notion of causation can be traced back to Aristotle and is a statement about how objects influence each other across space and time. From the correlation graph, we cannot make the claim that X is the cause of Y without extra manipulations. Causation is defined as a chain of dependency where the cause always precedes the effect. The cause is in the past of a present event. An event A is the cause of event B if the presence of A is necessary for B to happen. For A to have any effect on B, event A has to happen first. David Hume remarked that if the first object had not been, the second never had existed. In a deterministic framework, the presence of the cause is a necessary and sufficient condition for an effect to happen. Causality and determinism are often intertwined. Of course, an effect can have many co-occurring causes, but we are compelled to believe that we should be able to identify at least one. For example, when an individual gene alone cannot account for a mental disease. It can still be viewed as a conditional cause when co-occurring with other such causes. When enough necessary components occur together, they may be sufficient to induce the disease. Under this framework, the triad of correlations and necessary and sufficient conditions complement each other. In another formulation, one can distinguish an immediate or proximal cause, also called precipitating cause. A stroke in the motor area caused paralysis, or predisposing cause. She got upset, and sustaining cause. She had high blood pressure. Neither the predisposing nor the sustaining cause alone can be designated as a necessary and sufficient condition. Yet the proximal cause may not have happened without the sustaining and predisposing causes. Although Aristotle's formulation of the cause and effect relationship has undergone extensive revisions over the past millennia, it has remained the main tool of reasoning in the laboratory, likely due to its simplicity. However, even in everyday life, one can often see how such logic fails. My shadow follows me, and without me it never occurs. My shadow and I often correlate. I am the necessary but not sufficient condition because my shadow is not always detectable. In darkness, the suspected causal rule is violated because the occurrence of my shadow is conditional upon the presence of light. However, light is not a cause and not even co-contributing component, but a condition. Similar violations are found in neuroscience. A weak stimuli such as an ant climbing on my leg can sometimes induce reliable firings of neurons in multiple brain circuits and is prominently noticed. At other times, the same cause may not induce a noticeable effect at all. Again, the change in brain state is not considered a co-cause, but is a necessary condition for the detectable cause-effect relationship. Later, I highlight some of the pitfalls of our everyday reliance on causation as a scientific rule. My goal, of course, is not to disqualify formalized reasoning, but to call attention to why the simple recipe of logic fails in neuroscience, especially when things become really interesting. Because of the omnipresence of logical inference and causation in science, both philosophers and scientists have undertaken multiple rounds of explanations and attempt to refine them. Each time these concepts were approached with a particular point of view and purpose, and not unexpectedly, the resulting explanations vary. Philosophers are primarily interested in the ontological question of whether causation is an inherent property of the physical world independent of human mind, or whether it has epistemic limits. As we learned in the first chapter, David Hume's subjectivism. Separated the objective world from our first-person subjective experiences and introduced the idea that our mind transforms and represents the objective reality. He criticized rationalists who assumed that we can acquire knowledge of the world by trusting our minds. For instance, we observe a regular relationship between lightning and thunder, but the inference that lightning causes thunder is only a subjective mental operation, so there may be no objective causality between the two. Hume thought that we do not experience the cause itself. We simply infer it from the regular appearance of the cause and effect. Immanuel Kant countered Hume's interpretation by arguing that there is a universal principle of causality that cannot be based on experience. Kant promoted the idea that the realm of things in themselves, das Ding an sich, is the cause of the realm of appearances, phenomena. Our experience is shaped by a priori causality because the mind interprets the sensory inputs arriving from an objective, observer-independent world. Hume's idea of representation has shaped the thinking of cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists alike, and because the de facto scientific explanation of how attributes of objects become neuronal representations. His subjectivism has been modernized to subjective realism, in which the mind represents but does not faithfully mirror the outside reality. Therefore, my representation of truths and judgments can only become similar to your representations. Can only become similar to your representations through a mutually agreed consensus. Each brain in isolation would generate a somewhat different representation of the same object, color, or sound. If objective and subjective reality are separate, then our mental influence of causation does not necessarily apply to the relationships present in the physical world. Well, cause and effect is something that is a bit of a mind-bugger. Most people never reflect upon it, and that will mean that what people in general think will influence their cause and effect. It is not until we go in cause and effect that I would say the action can control it. Otherwise, cause and effect will be a representation, and I would claim it wouldn't be proper cause and effect. Once more, we would be just copycat, not thinking, just pressing Control C and copy whatever is there. The automatic process then we would refer to in our inner talk and to others as that was caused. The cause of effect of Hume and Kant, I would say both are the effects of cutting off the subject from the world. And the real ring to cause and effect, even in Aristotle, is a sort of subject-free cause and effect. What I make for claims of the world is not important. It is like we cut a domain of reality and call that independent, and we say cause and effect resides there. I think we can all agree on that is the general take on cause and effect. I would claim doing thus will make reality less real. Yes, I would say cause and effect can only be real once we interact with it, both on the inside and on the outside. Without a subjective cause and effect, there is no cause and effect at all. Once more proven by the Klein model, you will be living in reality, in unreality, in illusions. Cause and effect will, in a negative way, influence your life. You will be the victim of circumstances, quite literally. And there is nothing you can do about it until you really look into this cause and effect and realize there is a subjective side to it, and without that subjective side, there can be no understanding or controlling of the outside cause and effect. Taking from Samkhya, the Indian philosophy system, Prakriti, which is the real material world, cannot be real unless you engage in it. And I think that proves the point. And I would say, to say cause and effect is out there is devaluating reality. It's making it unreal. It is putting subjective bias only from yourself and no one else. Your personal subjective bias, you, Anders Karlsson, you, Lena Persson, or whatever your name is, you will put your subjective limitation on reality and say, this is a cause and effect. It will not be in concord with anyone else. And regardless what David Hume said, that cause and effect is agreed upon, like a contract, it is not. It will be diminished, it will be turned into nothingness. You will blunder and you will look a fool among other people, because by not controlling it, you will not participate in the public world. Heidegger has a similar point. Someone who's not in itself, that is Heimlich, he will not be outside neither. You lose at the both points. If you don't, like György just showed, especially in the previous chapter, if you don't control your movement, you will not control meaning of your thinking. Your thinking will be less. Thinking is never ever the same. Not even within yourself, not with different cultures. Meaning is different. Meaning is coming from a person that is subjective. That subjectivity is the force, I think Indian people would call it prana, that makes it possible to enter a collective shared reality. Whereas in the Western Hemisphere, the left hemisphere as you want, it is assumed to be the opposite. By eradicating yourself, you can somehow enter into the real world, take away the subject completely, take it out with chlorine, flex it out, bleach it out, like the scary view of Tractatus. Make it not part of the reality anymore. No, as shown by neurology and quantum mechanics, and I think more subjects are coming up like biology, shows clearly that taking away the subject makes the world out there unreal. And just the fact that only a few percent today do control their own world and can enter reality, 2-3% according to György, the rest living in the structures constructed by these 2-3%. The top of the company, the top of the country, the top of an organization, top of the military, and so on, so on. That is almost always the case. I have an example from Sweden here. During the post-war period, Sweden went to a neutral state and a stronger, sort of more active neutrality than was before the war. And I think most people in Sweden believe that we were actually neutral. But when you went up to the top, it is for them, they had access to more understanding. I don't say more information or knowledge, could have been the opposite, but more understanding by being on top, by being in command, by deciding for themselves, by being in reality. You get into the field of the body and then you understand we were not neutral. We were not neutral, but only those people understood. Not something that could be achieved by journalists, never, ever. And it never happened. No one questioned the neutrality until maybe the last 4 or 5 years of the Cold War. There was some people claiming a bit, but I bet you the field marshals, the air marshals, the 4-star generals, they all knew without even communicating it. And of course, some parts of the government also knew. I would say directly Olof Palme never knew, he didn't care. But the idea that Gunnar Sträng thought that we were neutral, no, there's no chance. And his predecessors, of course, knew, since they were actually active in the process. It's interesting. Something can be covered today in a way it could never have been before. And not understanding how we participate in reality to make it real. It's an active process. It takes your energy to participate in reality. It takes your energy, your prana, to be in an objective, shared reality with shared values, where people listen to you, and that where your inner thinking actually means something to yourself even. That takes participation, because every thought is the similar as a proper movement. Every thought is reality. It maps onto. In the way it maps, how, we don't know, we will never know probably, as he just mentioned, it will remain a riddle, but that's not important. Important is it maps. Maps, and you cannot imagine something you can't do. And I would say, my claim, my last claim, the end of this, you can probably do much more than you can imagine. And that's the easier way to stretch your imagination. And I also think children have a vivid imagination just because there are so many things they don't know. Once you started to know things in a too strict a manner, you start not doing things. And with a misunderstanding that the world is out there, an automatic aging process of the thinking comes about, I think. An aging process I haven't seen in the East. People are still quite alert and unbiased. But the aging of the mind and the establishments of things out there, that will in the end make the impression the world is already finished. Why should I think new things? Bourjac is just the opposite. It is a fantastic, positive revelation. Far from the case that everything is finished. it is just opening up. And it's becoming more and more potential. It is all like a big flower opening out from a bud. Everything is possible once we understand how we participate. And I think this existentialist postmodern is because we have so little knowledge today, and we even begin to fear knowledge, begin to fear limits, because we think we're going to have double limits. We're going to have this defense system that we're already in, and then we have to add other limits. And then it's like an autoimmune disease. We become sick of the things that heals us. Yeah, that's my point. And Bujaki is an apostle of the good news. The closest to a proper apostle in neurology I ever heard about. There are some in quantum mechanics in other regions, but Bujaki is definitely one of the good guys. And he has a funny accent. I like him. Okay, thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.